The doors of the Harrington Grand Ballroom opened at exactly 8:30 in the evening. 300 guests were already inside. The music was soft, the laughter was polished, and the air smelled of expensive perfume and ambition. Men in tailored suits stood in clusters near the bar. Women in designer gowns moved through the crowd like they owned every inch of it. Joshua Charles was standing near the center of the room with a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked comfortable. He looked like a man who had everything he wanted. Beside him, wearing a silver backless gown that had cost more than most people earned in a month, was Sharon Nathan. Sharon was laughing at something someone had said. Her head was tilted just enough for the chandelier light to catch her earrings. She had a way of positioning herself perfectly in any room. She had practiced it. She believed she had earned it. Joshua put his hand on the small of her back, and she leaned into it. This was their world now, or so they thought. Then the doors opened again. The room did not change all at once. It changed the way a wave moves before it reaches the shore, slowly first and then all together. The people near the entrance turned. The ones behind them turned. The people at the bar paused mid-sentence. The music did not stop, but somehow it seemed like it did. Deborah Collins walked in. She was wearing a deep purple gown that moved like water when she walked. It was not loud. It was not trying hard. It simply was, and it was stunning. The fabric caught the chandelier light in a way that made her glow from the inside. Her dark skin was smooth and radiant, her posture was straight and unhurried, and her eyes, calm, clear, and sharp, swept the room the way a person sweeps a room they already own. Her hair was pinned back in a style so clean it looked sculpted. The only jewelry she wore was a pair of diamond earrings and a thin bracelet on her right wrist. Nothing extra. Nothing unnecessary, everything exactly right. People stared. Not because they were being rude. They stared because Deborah Collins was the kind of woman who made you forget what you were about to say. She moved through the entrance with a slow, steady grace that did not ask for attention, but received it anyway. A woman near the entrance whispered something to the man beside her. He nodded. Someone at the bar set down their glass. 3 tables away, a woman grabbed her companion's arm and pointed. And then on the far side of the room, Joshua Charles looked up. His hand went still on Sharon's back. Sharon felt it before she saw it. She felt the change in his body, the small stiffening of his spine, the way his breath caught just slightly. She turned to see what he was looking at. She saw Deborah. For the first time since she had stepped into that silver dress, Sharon Nathan did not feel like the most beautiful woman in the room. The feeling landed like a stone dropped into still water. She told herself it was nothing. She stood up straighter. She pressed closer to Joshua, but Joshua had not moved. He was staring at the entrance, at the woman in the purple gown, at the woman he had convinced himself he no longer wanted. The woman he had told more than once that she needed to stop trying so hard. The woman he had left. That woman was here. And she looked like someone had opened a door to a version of herself that Joshua had never truly seen. Or maybe a version he had spent 8 years working to bury. Deborah did not look at him, not yet. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server. She smiled at a woman who approached her, a colleague from her years in forensic consulting, someone who had not seen her in a long time. They embraced. They laughed. Deborah's laugh was not performed. It was real and full and easy. More people came to greet her, senior partners, industry names, people who mattered in rooms like this. And Joshua Charles stood on the far side of the ballroom and watched his almost ex-wife work the room like she had never left. Sharon said something to him. He did not respond right away. She said it again. He turned to her with a smile that did not reach his eyes and said, "Sorry, he was just thinking." Sharon looked back across the room. Deborah was now deep in conversation with a group of people, her hand gesturing easily as she spoke. She looked like she belonged there. She looked like she had always belonged there. "Is that your wife?" Sharon asked, even though she already knew the answer. Joshua took a sip of his whiskey. "Ex-wife," he said. Sharon watched Deborah for a moment longer. There was something unsettling about the way the woman carried herself. It was not arrogance. It was something quieter and harder to name. The confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was walking into and was not afraid of any of it. Sharon turned away. She told herself she was not bothered. But her stomach did not agree. Across the room, Deborah Collins took a sip of water, smiled at something a colleague said, and finally, slowly, let her gaze drift to the far side of the ballroom. She found Joshua's eyes without searching. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned back to her conversation, as if he were simply part of the furniture. And that small, quiet moment was the most unsettling thing Joshua Charles had ever experienced, because she was not angry, she was not sad, she was not trying to make him feel anything at all. She was simply done, and somehow that was the most powerful thing of all. Before the gala, before the purple gown, before any of it, there was a different Deborah Collins. She had graduated at the top of her class, sharp with numbers, sharper with instinct. By 26, she was already building a name in forensic accounting, the kind of work that requires patience, precision, and the ability to find secrets buried deep inside spreadsheets. She was good at it, very good, the kind of good that gets noticed. She met Joshua Charles at a charity dinner. He was charming, well-dressed, and had a way of looking at her like she was the most interesting person in the room. She liked it. She was not foolish, she was human. She liked being seen. They dated for 2 years before he proposed. By then, Deborah was a senior associate at Ockaffer and Lane, one of the top forensic consulting firms in the city. Her name was beginning to appear in conversations that mattered. There was talk of a partnership track. And then she became Mrs. Joshua Charles. At first, nothing changed. She kept working. She kept building. But slowly, so slowly that she did not notice it happening, things began to shift. Joshua did not like the late nights at the office. He did not say it directly. He said things like, "I just miss you, and I thought we were building something together and you seem more focused on work than on us." He said it gently. He said it often enough. So Deborah started leaving the office earlier. Then he did not like it when she traveled for assignments. So she declined 2 projects that would have put her in front of major clients and earned her significant recognition. Then came the comment about her clothes. "You dress so seriously," he said once, laughing. "It is like you are always trying to prove something." She had laughed too at the time. But the next morning she reached past the sharp blazer she loved and picked something softer. It happened in layers, year by year, comment by quiet comment. She stopped pitching for the big accounts. She stopped accepting speaking invitations. She let her membership in 2 professional associations lapse because the meetings conflicted with dinners Joshua had planned. She started organizing her schedule around his and stopped thinking of her own as something that needed protecting. Her closest friend Adiz noticed before Deborah did. "You are making yourself smaller," Adiz told her one afternoon over lunch. "I can see it happening. It worries me." Deborah brushed it off. "I'm just focusing on my marriage," she said. "Your marriage should not require you to disappear," Adiz replied. Deborah did not answer. She changed the subject. She told herself Adiz did not understand the kind of commitment a real marriage required. She told herself she was being selfless and that selflessness was a virtue. She believed this for several years. Joshua, meanwhile, was doing the opposite of disappearing. His business was growing. He was appearing in industry magazines. He was attending galas and professional events, always polished, always in the right photograph. And Deborah was usually beside him, quieter than she used to be, dressed more softly than she once would have chosen, smiling with a warmth that sometimes felt rehearsed even to herself. She cooked. She organized. She managed the household so smoothly that there was never any friction, never anything for Joshua to worry about. She became very good at being invisible in a quiet, supportive way. She told herself this was love. This was what partnership looked like. She was wrong, she just did not know it yet. 8 years into their marriage, Deborah received a call about a partnership position at a consulting firm that had been following her career quietly. They were offering her a chance to come back fully, to lead a practice group, to build something that had her name on it. She came home that evening buzzing with it. She sat across from Joshua at dinner and told him everything, the call, the offer, what it would mean. She was trying not to smile too much. Joshua listened. He nodded. He asked a few questions. Then he said, "I do not think it is the right time. We have been talking about starting a family. That would be a lot to take on all at once." They had talked about a family, vaguely. Years ago, nothing had been decided. Deborah turned down the opportunity. 3 months later, she would learn that Joshua had already been seeing someone else before she ever had the chance to become a mother. But that evening, sitting across from her husband at their dinner table, Deborah Collins smiled and passed him the bread and told herself she had made the right choice. She had not. And somewhere deep in the part of her that had never fully gone quiet, she already knew it. The irony was not lost on her later, that she had spent her career identifying the exact moment a financial story stopped making sense, the point where numbers that should have added up simply did not. She was very good at spotting that inflection point in other people's accounts. She had missed it entirely in her own life. There were moments, scattered across the years, where she had felt the edges of her discomfort. A dinner where Joshua told a story about something she had done and got the details slightly wrong, and she had corrected him gently, and he had given her a look that was brief but clear. A weekend when she had worked from home on a small project she had taken on, and he had been quiet and strange for 2 days after without explaining why. Small things. The kind of things that feel individually manageable and collectively devastating. She had built a life around managing those small things, around keeping the surface smooth, around being easy to live with in a way that required her to be, by necessity, a reduced version of herself. She had called it being a good wife. It was only later that she understood the difference between being a good partner and being made invisible. Deborah had always trusted numbers more than words. Words could be bent. Words could be said with kindness while meaning something cruel. Words could move a person slowly, gently, in a direction they never agreed to travel. Deborah had learned this the hard way, but numbers did not lie. It started with a small thing, the kind of thing most people would miss entirely. She was reviewing their joint account one Saturday morning, something she still did out of professional habit, a reflex that had survived all the years she had spent making herself smaller. And she saw it, a charge from a hotel she did not recognize, not far from the city, not expensive enough to be a conference hotel. She looked at the date, a Tuesday in March. Joshua had said he was at a client dinner in the city that evening. She did not panic. Panicking was not how she worked. She opened the folder of bank statements she kept for tax purposes, and she started reading them the way she would read a client's books, carefully, systematically, without emotion. She sorted the transactions into categories. She built a timeline. She cross-referenced dates against Joshua's calendar, which she still had access to. What she found in the next 3 hours changed everything. Hotel charges, 12 of them over the past 14 months. Restaurant bookings in neighborhoods on the opposite side of the city from where Joshua said he was. A florist delivery to an address she did not recognize. A parking charge at a building she could not place. A jewelry purchase she had never seen or received. The amounts individually were not large, but they were consistent. They formed a pattern, and patterns were exactly what Deborah Collins had spent her career learning to read. She set the statements down. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat at the kitchen table and she breathed slowly for a few minutes. Then she picked up Joshua's old phone, the one he kept in the drawer of his study and had once told her was broken. She had never questioned it. She did not know why. She thought about it now. It was not broken. It opened to a message thread. The name at the top was simply S. She read the messages. They went back 14 months. She did not finish her tea. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving, not crying, not speaking, just sitting with the weight of 14 months and what it meant. The S had a full name, Sharon Nathan. Deborah knew that name. Not personally, she had never had a real conversation with Sharon, but she had seen her at one of Joshua's events over a year ago. Sharon had been confident and loud and laughing, and Deborah had registered her briefly and then thought nothing more of it. She put the phone back exactly as she had found it. She walked to her home office, sat at her desk, and opened her laptop. She had a decision to make. She could confront him. She could scream. She could fall apart in the way that would be completely understandable and completely human. She could let her pain drive her. Or she could do what she was trained to do. She chose the work. She opened a new spreadsheet. She labeled it Case File, JC. She began building a timeline, dates, amounts, locations, cross-referenced against Joshua's stated whereabouts and public calendar. She did not think about the messages she had read. She did not let herself picture the specifics of the betrayal. She focused only on the numbers, on what they were telling her, on what they meant. And then, because she was a forensic accountant and she knew how to look, she started pulling on another thread. Joshua had a property development business. She had seen the accounts before, years ago, when she still had any role in their shared financial life. She had not looked closely recently. She started looking closely now. What she found took her into the early morning hours. The cash withdrawals from the business account told the first part of the story. The company filings she could access through professional channels told the second. And the shell company she found at the end of a careful chain of transactions told the third. Joshua had not just been conducting an affair. He had been hiding money, quietly, systematically, from the marriage, from her. She saved the spreadsheet, encrypted it, and backed it up to a private cloud account Joshua did not know existed. Then she called Adiz. "I need you to come over," she said. Her voice was steady. Adiz arrived within the hour. She took one look at Deborah sitting straight at the kitchen table, laptop open, a stack of printed statements beside her, and sat down without asking any questions. "Tell me," Adiz said. Deborah told her everything. Adiz listened to all of it. When Deborah finished, Adiz reached across the table and placed her hand over hers. "What do you want to do?" Adiz asked quietly. Deborah looked at the spreadsheet on her screen. "I want to be very careful," she said. "And then I want to take back everything he tried to take from me." Adiz nodded. "Then let us start," she said. She had learned in her professional life that the worst thing an investigator could do at the beginning of a case was react. Reaction contaminated evidence. Reaction gave the subject advance warning. Reaction put you on the back foot before you had even begun to build your position. So she did not react. She processed. She organized. She let the facts speak to her in the language she had spent 15 years learning to understand. She also noted, without emotion, that the messages in the phone were affectionate, warm, the kind of messages sent by two people who are comfortable with each other and believe they are safe. That comfort told her something. Joshua had not expected this to be found. He had not been careful because he had not thought he needed to be. He had not believed, apparently, that the quiet woman who organized his household and cooked his meals and managed his calendar would ever look. Most people, when they discover they have been betrayed, act fast. They confront. They cry in the wrong places. They say things they later cannot take back. They let their pain lead them, and pain is a terrible navigator. It moves in circles. It makes noise when silence would be more useful. Deborah Collins did none of that. She took 1 week. During that week, she behaved exactly as she always had. She cooked dinner. She sat across from Joshua at their dining table and asked about his day and listened to his answers and gave nothing away. Not a word, not a look, not a single change in her breathing, because she was a forensic accountant who had worked on cases where one unguarded moment, one tipped hand, one flash of real feeling at the wrong time had given the opposing side the chance to move and cover and hide what they were supposed to answer for. She was not going to make that mistake. On the Monday of that week, she called Patricia Obi. Patricia was one of the sharpest divorce attorneys in the city. She did not advertise. She was not flashy. She was recommended quietly in careful conversations by people who knew what they were talking about. Adiz had found her through a friend 2 years ago and had described her in 4 words. She does not lose. Deborah made an appointment under her professional name, not her married name. She met with Patricia on a Thursday afternoon in a clean, quiet office on the 12th floor of a building with no reception desk visible from the elevator. Patricia was in her early 50s, with close-cut natural hair and reading glasses that she wore without apology. She listened to everything Deborah laid out: the hotel charges, the bank transfers, the second phone, the name Sharon Nathan, the pattern mapped across 14 months, without interrupting once. At the end, she asked a few precise questions. She made notes in a leather-bound book. Then she said, "You have more than enough to begin, but I want more on the financial side. The hidden assets are where this case becomes very interesting." Deborah smiled just slightly. "I was hoping you would say that," she said. She spent the following 2 weeks building the financial case the way she would have built it for any client who came to her firm with a complicated assignment. Methodically, layer by layer, without allowing emotion to enter the process. She did not have access to everything yet, but she could point to what she could not yet see. She could map the shape of it. She did not move out of the house. She did not change her routine. She continued to be, on the surface, Mrs. Joshua Charles, the quiet, supportive wife who kept the household running. But in the evenings, in her home office with the door closed, she worked. She worked with the kind of focus that only comes when a person finally stops pretending. She also did something else that mattered. She called Akefer and Lane. The senior partner, a man named Babaton who had known Deborah since her early career, answered personally. He was not surprised to hear her voice. He told her that her name had come up in their conversations as recently as several months ago. He said they had wondered what she was doing. He said they had always assumed she would come back. She told him she was looking to return to active consulting, that she had a few months of work to complete first, but that she would be available after that. He told her there was a place for her at the firm whenever she was ready. She thanked him and hung up. That night she sat in her home office with the door closed and let herself feel it. The hurt, the anger, the slow, deep grief of 8 years spent making herself smaller for a person who was not even paying attention to her. She cried quietly for about 20 minutes. Then she wiped her face, opened her laptop, and went back to work. She did not cry again after that. The plan was in motion. Everything else was just waiting for the right moment to arrive. On the third day of that week, Joshua came home from work and told her with some excitement that he had been invited to attend a gala in 3 weeks. He mentioned it casually, the way he mentioned most things now, as information delivered to a person who would manage the logistics around it. He did not ask if she wanted to come. He did not say they had been invited. He said he had been invited. She noted this. She filed it. She said, "That sounds like a good opportunity," and passed him the salad. After he went to bed, she sat at her kitchen table in the dark and added the gala date to the document she was building. She also, on a separate browser window, confirmed the details of that same event and registered her own attendance. Her invitation, which had arrived 6 days earlier through her professional network, was sitting unopened in her email. She opened it now and replied yes. She closed the laptop, washed the glasses from dinner, and went to bed. She slept better that night than she had in years, not because anything had been resolved, but because she was no longer drifting. She had a direction. She had a plan. And there is a particular kind of rest that comes to a person who has finally decided to take the wheel. Sharon Nathan believed she had one. It was not a complicated belief. It rested on simple facts as she understood them. Joshua had left his wife for her. He had chosen her. He showed up at her apartment several evenings a week. He took her to restaurants with long wait lists and menus that had no prices listed. He had brought her to 2 industry events in the past 6 months, standing beside her with his hand on her back like she belonged there naturally. As far as Sharon was concerned, she was the woman in the story who had gotten exactly what she wanted. She was 31 years old. She was attractive, and she knew it, not in an insecure way, but in the matter-of-fact way of someone who has simply accepted a fact about themselves. She ran a small event management company that was growing steadily, partly because of her own hustle, and partly because Joshua had quietly introduced her to a few of his clients. She wore good clothes. She kept her hair done. She laughed easily and made people feel in her company like the most interesting person in any room. She had grown up being told she was charming, and she had used charm the way experienced people use the right tool for the right task. She had not set out to become the other woman. She had told herself this many times over the past 14 months. She had met Joshua at an event she had organized 18 months ago. He had been warm and attentive and had called her the next day. She had told herself he was practically separated. He had said something close enough to the same thing. And somewhere between believing him and not asking the right questions, she had ended up exactly here. She did not think much about Deborah. This was easier than it might sound. Deborah Collins, by the time Sharon appeared in Joshua's life, had become a kind of ghost in his telling. Joshua mentioned her rarely. When he did, it was with the detached tone of a man who had simply moved on. "She is very focused on being comfortable," he said once. "She stopped growing a long time ago." Sharon had nodded. She had seen one photograph of Deborah, an old one from a professional event, and the woman in the photo looked pleasant and quiet. Not someone who caused concern, not someone who came to mind. So Sharon focused on the life she was building. She imagined sometimes what it would look like when Joshua was fully free, when the divorce was finalized. She imagined being introduced as his partner properly in rooms where it mattered. She imagined them traveling together. She had looked at rings once in a magazine and had closed the magazine before Joshua could see. She was not naive. She was simply optimistic in the way of someone who has always found that things worked out for her. What she did not know, what she could not have known because Joshua did not know it either, was that the divorce had already been prepared. Not by Joshua, by Deborah. What she also did not know was the full nature of Joshua's finances. She knew he was comfortable. She knew he had a beautiful house, a successful company, the trappings of a certain kind of life. But she had not asked the specific questions. He had not offered the specific answers. She would come to regret that. But in these weeks before the gala, Sharon Nathan was happy. She was planning a dinner party at her apartment. She was choosing flowers for her living room. She was trying on gowns for a charity event Joshua had mentioned they would attend. She settled on a silver dress. She tried it on 3 times, and each time she was satisfied. She had no idea that on the other side of the city, a woman in a deep purple gown was already preparing to walk into her story and rearrange every word of it. Sharon had grown up in a family where confidence was the primary currency, and she had been rich in it from an early age. She had learned to read rooms quickly, to know within minutes of entering a space who held the power, who wanted to be seen, and how to position herself in relation to both. This skill had served her well in event management, where the entire job was essentially about understanding what people wanted and making them feel, for one evening, that they had exactly that. It had also, if she was honest with herself in her quieter moments, been the skills she had applied when she first realized Joshua Charles was paying attention to her. She had read the situation. She had made her choices. She had chosen not to ask the questions that might have changed her mind. She sometimes wondered what Deborah was like, not with guilt exactly, more with a passing curiosity. Joshua's description of her was always the same: comfortable, quiet, stopped growing. But descriptions from the person who left were never the most reliable source. Sharon knew this. She had simply found it convenient to believe the version that made her feel better about her own choices. On the evening before the gala, she laid the silver dress on her bed and looked at it. It was beautiful. She had tried it on twice that week. She felt ready. She felt like a woman who was exactly where she was supposed to be. She did not know that 11 blocks away, in an apartment she had never seen, a woman in a deep purple gown was hanging it on the back of a wardrobe door and going back to reviewing legal documents before bed. Numbers had never lied to Deborah Collins. She had spent her career on the understanding that inside every set of financial records there was a story. Sometimes it was boring, sometimes it was complicated, and sometimes, rarely but memorably, it was the kind of story that made you sit very still for a long time after you finished reading it. Joshua's finances were that kind of story. She had started with what she could access directly: their joint accounts, the household records, the company filings available through public registries. She organized these into a master document and layered the data so that patterns would surface the way they always did, slowly at first, then all at once. The first pattern she found was the cash withdrawals. Over the past 3 years, Joshua had been pulling regular cash amounts from his business operating account. Not large amounts individually, between $2,000 and $4,000 each time, most often on Fridays. But they were consistent, systematic, and they totaled, across 38 months, over $140,000 that had left a formal account and entered the shadow world of untraceable spending. She noted it, tagged it, moved on. The second pattern was more interesting. Joshua was a partner in a property development company, Charles and Associates. He owned 60%. His business partner, Gerald Price, owned the remaining 40%. The firm had completed 4 projects over 5 years. Deborah had attended 3 launch events for those projects. What she found, buried in company filings she requested through a professional channel she still had access to, was a significant problem. The declared profit from 2 of those 4 projects was substantially lower than it should have been given the confirmed sale prices of the developed units and the documented construction costs. Someone had removed money from the equation before it was ever declared. The difference was not a rounding error. She traced the missing funds to a shell company registered under a name she did not recognize. But the registered address of that shell company was a property she found, after 2 careful hours of tracing, to be held in Joshua's name alone. An investment property she had never been told about. A property that appeared nowhere in any conversation they had ever had about their financial life. She sat back in her chair. She had seen this structure before in client cases. It was not sophisticated by the standards of serious financial crime, but it was deliberate, carefully layered, the kind of arrangement that requires planning and a willingness to deceive someone who trusts you. What it meant, in simple terms, was this: Joshua Charles had been moving marital income into personal assets that he planned to declare did not exist. He had been preparing for a future in which Deborah received far less than she was owed. She compiled everything into a single report, 72 pages, organized by category, supported by documentary evidence at every point, annotated clearly enough that any court or investigative body could follow the logic without needing her to explain it twice. She printed it, bound it, placed it in a plain envelope. Then she drove to Patricia Obie's office. Patricia called that evening. "Deborah," she said, "this is thorough." "I know," Deborah said. "This goes beyond the divorce. The Financial Crimes Authority would want to see this. I know that too, Deborah said. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Do you want to go that route? She asked. Deborah thought about it. She thought about 8 years of quiet erasure. She thought about the dinner she had cooked last Tuesday while Joshua was almost certainly with Sharon. She thought about the partnership she had turned down. She thought about the version of herself she had slowly agreed to bury. Yes, she said, I want to go all the way. Patricia was quiet for another moment. Then, I will need 3 more weeks to prepare the documents properly. Can you hold? I have been holding for 8 years, Deborah said. 3 more weeks is nothing. She hung up, closed her laptop, and sat in the silence of her home office. And for the first time in a long time she felt something that was not grief or anger or resignation. She felt clear, sharp, entirely herself. She had worked on fraud cases that involved far more money than this and far more sophisticated concealment methods. She had worked with clients who were up against genuinely clever adversaries. Joshua was not that. What he had done was effective enough to fool someone who was not looking. It was not effective against someone who was. The thing that struck her most, sitting with the completed report, was the timeline. The first transaction in the shell structure dated to 26 months ago. That meant this had been running while she was still setting aside her own professional opportunities, while she was turning down the partnership offer, while she was cooking dinners and organizing calendars and telling herself that this was what love looked like. He had been building his exit while she was building his comfort. She sat with that for a moment. Then she saved the file and printed the final page. The work had taken everything she had professionally, applied to a situation that was entirely personal. She had not known, until now, that those two parts of her could operate simultaneously without one interfering with the other. The personal grief was real. The professional work was clean. They existed side by side in her, and she was grateful for that, grateful that the years of training had given her something sturdy enough to stand on when everything else was uncertain. 3 weeks later, on a quiet Thursday morning, everything was in place. The divorce petition had been filed. It was comprehensive, citing the financial evidence Deborah had compiled, the documented hidden assets, the pattern of financial deception spanning the length of the marriage. Patricia had also, through the appropriate legal channels, submitted a formal referral to the Financial Crimes Commission flagging the shell company structure and the suspected diversion of marital funds. Joshua did not know yet. He would be served at his office the following Monday. Patricia had arranged for it to happen at 11 in the morning, a deliberate choice. Public enough that a scene would have consequences, private enough to remain legally appropriate. Deborah had moved through all of this preparation with the same steady focus she had brought to the entire process. She had signed what needed signing. She had provided what needed providing. She had answered Patricia's questions carefully and completely. She had not rushed anything. And then, on the Thursday after it was all filed, she did something she had not done in years. She walked into a salon. Not the neighborhood place she had been using for several years. A perfectly adequate salon she had drifted to because it was easy and did not require any planning. She walked into a Lara Lux on Clarence Avenue, the kind of place that had a 3-week waiting list and a staff that treated each client like the only person in the city. She had booked the appointment 2 weeks earlier and told no one. She sat in the chair and told the stylist what she wanted. The stylist listened, looked at her face and her bone structure and the line of her neck, and said, "I know exactly what you mean." 2.5 hours later, Deborah looked in the mirror. The woman looking back was someone she recognized, someone she had not seen clearly in a long time. Not a new person, that was not the right way to describe it. More like a return, a restoration, the shape of herself that had always been there, that had been quietly waiting under everything Joshua had convinced her to cover up. She went from the salon to a boutique on the same street, a place Adiz had mentioned months ago. The woman who helped her was patient and honest. She brought out several options. Deborah tried most of them and ruled them out one by one, too casual, too formal, not quite right for the occasion. Then the woman returned with a gown. Deep purple, structured at the top, moving like liquid from the waist down. Simple in its construction, which was exactly why it was beautiful. The fabric was the kind that caught light rather than reflecting it. It seemed to hold the brightness and release it slowly. Deborah put it on. She stood before the mirror for a long moment. "That is the one," the woman said quietly from behind her. Deborah nodded. On that same morning, she had confirmed her attendance at the Harrington Gala, one of the city's most prestigious annual events, to which she had been invited through the professional network she was quietly rebuilding. She had accepted the invitation 2 weeks earlier. The event was in 10 days. She also knew, because she had heard through Adiz who moved through overlapping social circles, that Joshua and Sharon would be there. She had known this when she said yes. She went home that evening and hung the purple gown on the back of her wardrobe door. She stood in the bedroom and looked at it for a while, the way you look at something that represents more than itself. Then she poured herself a glass of water, sat at her desk, and went back to reviewing the legal documents Patricia had sent over. She was not going to the gala to perform anything. She was not going to make a scene or say anything dramatic or try to prove a point. She was simply going to show up, as herself, fully, for the first time in a very long time. And she knew, with the calm certainty of someone who had done the real work, that this alone would be enough. The drive back from the boutique took 20 minutes. She had the gown in a garment bag on the back seat and the radio playing something instrumental and low. She drove carefully, the way she drove when she was thinking about something important. She thought about the gala. She thought about walking through those doors. She did not think about Joshua's reaction or Sharon's reaction or what anyone would say afterward. She thought only about herself, about how it would feel to walk into a room like that as Deborah Collins, not as an attachment to someone else, about how long it had been since she had entered any room with her full name and her full weight behind her. She thought it would feel very good. When she got home, she hung the gown, made tea, and sat for a moment in the kitchen. The house was quiet. It was almost always quiet now in these weeks of holding. She had grown used to the quiet. She had started to find it comfortable rather than empty. That was a change she had not been expecting. She picked up her phone and sent Adiz a message. "It is done, all of it. I found the gown." Adiz replied in 30 seconds, "Purple." "Purple," Deborah wrote back. 3 dancing dots. Then, "I'm already planning what to wear." The evening of the Harrington Gala arrived with the kind of clean, cool air that made the city feel entirely awake. Deborah began getting ready at 5 in the afternoon. She was not rushed. She moved through each step of the evening the way she now moved through everything, with intention, without hurrying, without the low background anxiety she had carried for years without even numbing it. Adiz had arrived at 4:30, officially to help, really to witness. She sat on the edge of the bed and watched her friend move through the room with a calm that looked, from the outside, like peace. "Are you nervous?" Adiz asked. No, Deborah said, and it was true. She was not nervous, not excited in the fluttery, anxious way she might have expected. What she felt was simpler and steadier than that. Settled, like a person who has finished packing and is simply waiting for the car. She dressed carefully. The diamond earrings, the thin bracelet, the purple gown went on last. She stood before the mirror and looked at herself, not checking details, but looking in the deeper way you look when you are confirming something you already know. She saw a woman who had done the work. Not just the past 3 months of spreadsheets and late evenings and legal preparations. All of it. The longer, quieter work of remembering who she was, of deciding to come back. Adiz stood and came to stand beside her. She looked at Deborah in the mirror for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Deborah, you are stunning." Deborah smiled, a real one. The car arrived at 7. She walked through the lobby of the Harrington Grand at 8:25. She handed her invitation to the attendant. He checked it, nodded, and pulled the doors open. She walked in. The rest of it she heard described by others in the days after. A senior partner at one of the top firms told a mutual colleague he had looked up at the entrance and genuinely lost his train of thought. A woman she knew only slightly said the room had gone quiet in a way she had never experienced at an event before. One of the photographers had physically stepped back to adjust his angle. Deborah did not notice most of this. She moved through the room the way she moved when she was fully herself, not performing, not calculating, just walking, just being there. She greeted the people who came to her. Old colleagues who were visibly pleased to see her out and active. A former client who shook her hand and said, "I have been waiting for you to come back." A peer from her early career who introduced her to 3 people in succession, each of whom knew her work by name. She accepted sparkling water. She moved between conversations with ease. Then from across the room she saw Joshua. He was very still. His drink was in his hand, but he was not drinking. He was staring at her. Beside him, Sharon Nathan stood in the silver gown that had looked perfect that morning in her apartment mirror, and now, in this room, in this light, beside this woman in deep purple, had somehow lost its certainty. Deborah held Joshua's look for 3 seconds. Then she looked away and returned to her conversation. She was aware, without tracking it directly, of the movement on that side of the room. A woman beside Sharon said something. Sharon responded. Sharon looked her way again. Deborah did not return the look. Later in the evening, Joshua approached her. He waited until she was between conversations. He came alone, moving with the careful body language of a man who did not know what he was walking into. "Deborah," he said. She turned and looked at him. Her expression was polite and entirely level. "Joshua," she said. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they once owned, and did not understand until it was gone. "You look," he began. "Please speak with my attorney if you have anything to say to me," she said. Not unkindly, not with any heat behind it, simply clearly in the way of someone stating a fact. Then she turned back to the conversation she had stepped away from, as if he had not interrupted anything at all. Joshua stood alone for a moment. Then he walked back to where Sharon was waiting. Sharon said something to him when he returned. He answered briefly. She looked across the room one more time. Deborah Collins was laughing at something a colleague had said. Her head was tilted back slightly, and the chandelier light caught the deep purple of her gown and the brightness of her earrings. And she looked, from any angle you chose, like a woman who had everything she needed and knew exactly where she was going. Sharon Nathan looked down at her silver dress. And for the first time since this whole thing began, she felt the beginning of something she could not put a name to, something that felt very much like the end. There was a moment, somewhere in the middle of the evening, when Deborah stepped to the edge of the room and stood alone for a few minutes. She held her glass and looked out at the crowd, the color and the noise and the particular energy of a room full of people who believed their presence mattered. She had been in rooms like this before, many times, and in most of those times she had been standing slightly behind Joshua, slightly quieter than she felt, slightly smaller than she was. She stood in the same physical space tonight and felt entirely different, not louder, not more aggressive, just present, fully, completely, unapologetically present. She thought of Adiz, who was standing 20 feet away with a glass of champagne talking to someone she had just met, and who caught Deborah's eye across the room and raised her glass just slightly. Deborah raised hers back. That was enough, that small, quiet exchange between 2 women who understood what the evening meant was enough. Monday arrived with the kind of quiet, ordinary morning that had no idea what was about to happen inside it. At 11 o'clock, two people entered the offices of Charles and Associates in the business district. One was a process server. The other was a representative from the Financial Crimes Commission, carrying a letter and a formal list of questions that Joshua Charles was now legally required to address. The process server handed the divorce petition to Joshua personally. His assistant was in the hallway. Behind the glass of the adjacent office, Gerald Price looked through and could see, from Joshua's body language, that something was very wrong. Joshua opened the envelope. He read the first page, then the second, then he sat down. The divorce filing itself might have been manageable in his mind at any rate. He had been expecting it eventually. He had told himself it would be straightforward, that Deborah would want the house and some maintenance payments, and that would close the matter. What he had not expected was the financial addendum. 72 pages. 72 pages of documented evidence cross-referenced, organized by category, annotated clearly, that traced every cash withdrawal, every company transaction, every shell structure, every hidden account back to its source. It was the kind of document prepared by someone who did this professionally and who knew precisely what they were looking for. It read like a case file, because it was one. He read 20 pages, then he set it down and called his lawyer. His lawyer read the summary that afternoon and said, "Joshua, this is serious." The Financial Crimes Commission representative had been shown to the conference room, where he sat with his questions. Joshua was informed that he did not have to answer immediately. He was also informed that the questions would be answered eventually, with or without his cooperation. Gerald Price came into Joshua's office after the visitors left. He closed the door. He stood in the middle of the room with the look of a man calculating something. "What is happening?" he said. Joshua did not answer immediately. "The structure we used for the Elmwood project and the harbor development," Joshua said finally. Gerald's face changed. "She found it," Joshua said. Gerald sat down. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I want my own attorney." He left without another word. Over the following weeks, the architecture of Joshua's world began to come apart in the orderly, grinding way that legal and financial processes move. Business accounts were frozen pending the investigation. Gerald retained separate legal representation and began cooperating with investigators in ways that did not extend to protecting Joshua's position. The investment property was located and identified. The shell company account was traced and flagged. The paper trail that Deborah had assembled pointed clearly and consistently in one direction. At home, the house that Deborah had left 6 days after the gala, moving into a clean, bright apartment she had already arranged, Joshua was alone with the situation he had made. He tried to contact Deborah through channels that were not legal ones. Each time, Patricia Obi responded on Deborah's behalf, redirecting everything to the appropriate process. There was no back door. There was no conversation to be had outside of the formal proceedings. Sharon called on the Wednesday of the second week. The call lasted 11 minutes. She did not come over that evening. She called again the following Friday. The call was shorter. After that, she stopped calling. The settlement that was eventually reached, after several months of legal process, gave Deborah her full share of the marital assets, including a significant portion of the value of the hidden ones. The calculation reflected what 8 years of her life had actually been worth. It was not a small number. Joshua received a formal investigation, significant fines, and the kind of professional reputation damage that does not repair itself quickly. The business restructured. Gerald moved forward with his own future and his own separate legal arrangement. The industry circles that Joshua had moved through with such confidence began to feel less comfortable. He did not go to prison. The financial conduct, while serious and deliberate, did not meet the threshold for criminal prosecution as organized fraud, but the civil consequences were real and lasting, and the professional ones followed his name quietly, everywhere he went, for a long time after. It was not a dramatic ending for Joshua Charles, but it was a real one, built slowly and carefully by the woman he had underestimated. The woman who had been in the room all along, reading everything, missing nothing, and waiting for exactly the right moment. What Joshua had not understood before all of this began was that Deborah's quiet had never been weakness. He had interpreted her stillness as passivity, her patience as acceptance, her lack of confrontation as a sign that she did not see clearly. He had built his understanding of her on the version she had presented during those years of making herself smaller, and that version had been so convincing, so seamlessly maintained, that he had forgotten entirely who she was before it. The woman who had sat in his conference room's outer hallway and read 72 pages of financial evidence against him was the same woman who had once been offered a partnership track at one of the most respected consulting firms in the city. He had talked her out of accepting that offer. He had, at the time, considered this a success. He thought about that during the long evenings in the house that was now, for all legal purposes, in dispute. He thought about a great many things during those evenings. What he arrived at, eventually, was not grief exactly. It was something more like recognition. He had done a specific kind of damage, and he had not been as invisible as he thought, and the person he had underestimated had turned out to be the most capable person in the entire situation. He had no one to blame but himself. He had known this since the moment he read page one of that 72-page report. Some things are clear from the very first sentence. 6 months is not a long time. But a great deal can change in 6 months when a person stops moving against themselves and starts moving forward. On a bright Tuesday morning in her 6th month of freedom, Deborah Collins stood in the kitchen of her apartment and made coffee the way she liked it, strong, no sugar, and looked out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city waking up below. The apartment was on the 14th floor. She had chosen it for the light. It had tall windows on 2 sides, and in the mornings the whole space filled up with a brightness that felt almost physical. She had furnished it herself, with the deliberate care she had spent years applying to other people's problems and never her own. Every piece was something she had chosen because she genuinely liked it, not because it was acceptable or likely to go unnoticed, because she liked it. Her name was on the lease, only her name. Deborah Collins Consulting had been formally registered 4 months ago. She had started with 2 clients, referrals from the partners at Okafor and Lane, who had been as good as their word, and welcomed her back into their professional network with the warmth of people who had always known what she was worth. She had taken on the early work carefully, choosing clients she wanted to work with, moving at a pace that felt right rather than urgent. By the end of the 2nd month, she had 4 clients. By the end of the 4th month, she had 7. 2 of them had come directly to her, people who had heard her name through the right channels and had reached out without an introduction from anyone. Just her name, just her reputation, which had apparently survived the years of quiet even as she had not been visible. She was good at this work. She had always been good at it. The years she had spent making herself small had not erased the skill. They had simply paused it. On the day the business was officially registered, Adiz had taken her out to dinner. They had ordered everything they wanted and stayed at the table until the restaurant asked them very politely to leave. Adiz had raised her glass and said, "To the woman who was here the whole time." Deborah had laughed, and they had clinked glasses, and that was that. She did not think much about Joshua. She was aware in the background that the legal matters were still resolving. Patricia sent updates when updates were needed, and Deborah read them and responded as required. But she did not dwell on them. That chapter felt closed even as the final pages were still being written. She thought about Sharon Nathan even less. She had nothing to say to Sharon and no particular feeling about her either way. Sharon had made her choices and was living with whatever they had produced. That had nothing to do with Deborah. What Deborah thought about, in the quiet moments of these months, was the future. the direction of the forensic consulting space, a paper she was working on for an industry journal, a piece about financial pattern detection that had taken her 2 weeks to write and had been, quietly, one of the most satisfying things she had produced in years. She thought about a potential collaboration with a woman named Rosalind, who ran her own practice in financial litigation support and had reached out after reading a preview of the paper. They had met twice for coffee. The conversations had been interesting enough that a third meeting was already scheduled. She thought about Nairobi. She had been invited to speak at a conference there, a formal invitation from a professional body she respected. She had said yes. It was the first speaking engagement she had accepted in 9 years. She had said yes without hesitation and without asking anyone's opinion. She was not looking for romance. She was not closed to it either. She simply had no room for it right now and no interest in filling any space with anything that was not freely chosen. She was full in the way a person becomes full when they stop pretending they are something they are not. On a Saturday morning in the middle of the 6th month, Adiz came over for lunch. They sat at the kitchen table in the bright morning light, talking for 3 hours about everything and nothing. A book Adiz had read, a case Deborah was deep into, a trip they might take together in the spring. When Adiz left, Deborah stood at the window for a while. She thought about the woman she had been 8 years ago, sharp and ambitious and full of direction, with a whole open life ahead of her. And she thought about the woman she was now, quieter in some ways, harder in others, but also more rooted, more clear, more fully and precisely herself. She was not the same person. She was better. She picked up her coffee, took a slow sip, and sat down at her desk. She had work to do. And for the first time in a very long time, the work was entirely her own. She had started running again. Not competitively, not with any goal in mind, just early mornings, before the city got loud, along the path beside the river that was a 10-minute walk from her building. She had not run in 11 years. She had not missed it exactly during that time. But now that she had started again, she felt it clearly, the particular satisfaction of doing something that belongs only to you, that no one else benefits from or has any claim on. The mornings were her favorite part of the day. The coffee, the window, the light coming in, the sense of a schedule she had built herself and could change whenever she wanted. She made her own appointments. She worked the hours she chose. She ate what she actually liked for dinner and did not apologize for any of it. None of this was dramatic. That was the point. The happiness she had found in these 6 months was not loud or remarkable. It was simply hers, steady and genuine and present every single morning when she woke up.